The last thing that we're going to learn in this section is how to programmatically create and fill arrays. So far, we have always simply created arrays like this, right? So basically writing them out by hand, literally. So just like this, or maybe we might have done it also like this. So using a new and then the array constructor, and then passing in all the numbers here as arguments, and then that also creates this array, right? Now, in these cases, we basically already have our data. So, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 7. So that's the data that we already have. And so therefore, we could then manually create these arrays. However, we can actually also generate arrays programmatically, so without having to define all the items manually. And there are many situations in which this is necessary, and there are also multiple ways of doing it. And the easiest one is to again use the array constructor function. So let's create a new array here like this. And then I will pass in only one argument, 7. So what do you think is going to happen? Well, we might think that this is going to create an array with only one element, number 7, right? But actually it doesn't. Instead, it creates a new array with 7 empty elements in there. And it simply contains nothing. So this output is very weird indeed. And the reason for that is this weird behavior of this array function, which does it so that whenever we only pass in one argument, then it creates a new empty argument with that length. So if we don't know about this special particularity of the array constructor function, then this can lead to weird errors. Okay? Now, also, we cannot really use this X array for anything. For example, we cannot call the map method on it to now fill it up. For example, we might want to do this. So map, and then in each element, we might simply want to put something there, like a 5. But then you will see, well, actually we need to log it to the console. But you will see that nothing happened here. So this is not really useful except for one thing, because there is one method that we can call on this empty array, and that is the fill method. So that's a new method that we haven't studied yet, but it's very straightforward. So let me show it to you. So that's x.fill, and then all we need to do is to pass in a value, and it will then fill up the entire array with this specific value. Okay? And this does actually mutate the underlying array. So we can just change it there, and then simply log the entire thing to the console here. So this doesn't work. Let's take it out. And now we get this array full of 1s. But let's actually turn this off so we can experiment a little bit more with fill, because this method is actually a little bit similar to the slice method. So besides this value that we want to fill the array with, we can also specify where we want it to start to fill. So let's say only at index 3. And so we also can specify a begin parameter, and then it only starts at index 3, which is this one. So it will then fill it up until the end, unless we specify an end parameter, just like in slice. So let's say 5, and also just like in a slice, the final index here is not going to be included in the array. So just these two here are filled up. And of course, we can also use the fill method on other arrays. So it doesn't have to be an empty array. Let's say we actually define this here as an array. Okay, and then we can also fill that array. So let's say r.fill, let's fill it with 23 at position 4 to 6. And again, it will mutate the original one. And so you see that we put these 23s in these two positions. So from 4 to 6. Let's say from 2 to 6 to put some more in there. Okay? So this is the fill method plus empty arrays. So empty arrays plus fill method. And with this, we created an array programmatically, so without actually having to write it down manually, right? So let's bring this part back also to see it. So it's an entire new array that we here just created with our code. And indeed, the fill method can be very useful sometimes. However, what if we actually wanted to recreate the array from our first example? So what if we wanted to create this R array programmatically? Well, for that, we could use the array.from function. So that's array.from. And this is how we use it. And this is actually something completely new. And we didn't see this before. So here we are not using the from here as a method on an array. Okay? Instead, we are using it on the array constructor. So that's why it's array.from. And this array here is exactly the same as this one. So this function. So again, array here is a function. And then on this function object, we call the from method. So that sounds confusing, but we will make more sense of it in the object-oriented programming section. But anyway, into this function here, we can first pass in an object with the length property. So let's set it to 7. And then the second argument is a mapping function. So it is exactly like the callback function that we pass into the map method. So to start, let's also programmatically recreate this array here of 7 ones. And so let's write a callback function here. And in this case, we don't even need any arguments, but we still have to write the function. So let's write an arrow function here, which will simply return 1 in each iteration. So no arguments, no current element, no current index, and nothing. So all we want to return is a 1, and that will then put a 1 in each of the array positions. So let's call this one here y, and then log it to the console. And indeed, we get here the exact same result that we had before. But in my opinion, this is a lot cleaner than using this weird new array behavior then and together with the fill method. So in my opinion, this is way nicer. But anyway, let's now take it one step further and actually create this initial array from 1 to 7. So array.from length equals 7, and then our callback function. And as always, we get access to the current element. So let's call it current first, and then the current index. And so the index will vary between 0 and 6. And so all we have to return from this function is I plus 1. Okay? So again, this callback function here is exactly like the one in a map method. So you can simply imagine that you're using this as a callback function in calling the map method on an empty array. Okay? And so as always, we get access to the current element and the index. And so adding 1 to the index will then give us values from 1 to 7. So z meant, yeah, here we go. Now remember how earlier I used a variable like this, so an underscore, which means a throwaway variable. And so this is another use case for using this convention, because we do not need this current value at all. But we still, of course, have to define something as the first parameter, because the index that we need is only the second parameter. But to denote that we are not using this current element, we simply write an underscore. Okay, and then other programmers will also understand this convention and automatically know that we don't use this parameter. Okay? So this is how we create an array programmatically, and I hope you can see all kinds of different use cases for this. For example, you could create an array with 100 random dice rolls. So maybe you want to try that out on your own, and that is actually one of the assignments that I have later here for this section. So there's going to be a couple of exercises, and this will be one of them. But you can try it out immediately if you feel like it. So try array.from to generate an array with 100 random dice rolls. Okay, see if you can do that. But anyway, let's now move on and see a more real use case of the array.from function. Now, this array.from function was initially introduced into JavaScript in order to create arrays from array-like structures. So remember how I talked about so-called iterables before? So things like strings, maps, or sets, they are all iterables in JavaScript. And so they can be converted to real arrays using array.from. Okay? And that's the reason also for the name of the function, because we can create arrays from other things. All right? Now, besides these obvious iterables that I just mentioned, like maps or sets, another great example of an array-like structure is the result of using query selector all. So maybe you remember that query selector all returns something called a node list, which is something like an array which contains all the selected elements. But it's not a real array, and so it doesn't have methods like map, for example. But it's not a real array, and so it doesn't have most of the array methods like map or reduce. So if we actually wanted to use a real array method like that on a node list, we would first need to convert the node list to an array. And for that, array.from is perfect. So let's do something here now. And let's say that we do not have the movements of our application here stored in an array. So let me show that real quick. So again, let's pretend that we only have these values, so all of these movements only stored here in the user interface, but we do not have them somewhere in our code. So we don't have an array containing these values. But now, let's say we want to calculate their sum. And so therefore, we need to somehow get them first from the user interface and then do the calculation based on that. So let's create a variable called movements UI. So the ones that we get from the user interface. So array.from, and now here the element that we want to convert to an array. And so that's going to be document.querySelector all, and then it is the movements value class. I'm going to show it to you in a second. So movements value. So in our HTML, we can see that exactly this is where the value itself is stored. And so that's what we want to get. So these numbers, right? And so we are selecting all of the elements that have this class. All right. So let's just start by checking it out. Movements UI. But now we only get 2 elements here. And so that's the one that by the time we load this script here are already in the user interface. So it's this and this one here. So not the 7 that are loaded from the account object. So it's not going to be these 7 here. Okay. So if we wanted to actually select exactly these elements, we would have to do this code here on some event handler. So let's do that actually. Let's simply perform this action when we click somewhere here. Let's say here on this balance label. So it doesn't matter where we click. So that is called the label balance. So we can attach event listeners to every object. Okay, it doesn't have to be a button. So I think we never did this actually. But let's see what happens now. So let's log in again here. And again, remember that we are doing this so that we can now read these 7 movements from the user interface as we click here. And indeed, now it worked. So now we get these 8 movements here. And you see that indeed it is these values that we see now on the screen. All right. But now let me also show you that we cannot call the map method on it, because the map method would be useful to now actually get just the number. Because you see that here we also have this euro sign, and so we need to get rid of that. And so the map method would be perfect for that. So what we would like to do is, let's just do it here for now. We would love to take the current movement. All right. And so in this case, the movement here, well, let's just call it element actually, because right now it is a DOM element. So we would take this movement, which is, remember, one of these elements here. And so from this element, we need to take the text content. And then we also want to replace the euro sign with nothing, basically. So I'm using the emoji picker here again on the Mac, but you can just get the symbol from your text up there. So from the code we already wrote. And I want to replace it with nothing. But now you will see, as we try this again, that it's not going to work. And in fact, it does actually work. And that's because I was saying it wrong. Of course it's going to work, because this one here is already a real array at this point. So we created this movement UI using array.from. And so of course it is going to work already. It would not work if we did it directly on the result of the query selector all. Okay? So sorry for that mistake. So it did indeed work already. But we can make this even better. First, of course, we need to convert this to a number. But that is not the point here, actually. So the point is that we can use now the second argument of the array from a function here, which is, remember, the mapping callback. And so basically, we can simply put this entire callback right here as the second argument. Okay, and now this movement UI array is already the final array as we see it here. So let's just check that out and then make really clear what just happened here. So again, and as we click here, we get indeed all the numbers that we have here. So let's recap. We used array.from to create an array from the result of the query selector all, which is a node list, which is not really an array, but an array-like structure. And that array-like structure can easily be converted to an array using array.from. And then as a second step, we even included a mapping function, which then transforms that initial array to an array exactly as we want it. So basically converting the raw element to its text content and replacing the euro sign with nothing. Okay, and so then in the end, we end up exactly with the array of numbers that we intended. And by the way, I'm not sure if I mentioned it earlier, but there is another way of converting this here to an array. So let me grab it here. So movements UI2, and then we can actually spread the result of this query selector all into a new array as well. So this also creates the array, but then we would have to do the mapping separately. And so actually I prefer this. So to me, the array.from function was a great addition to JavaScript in ES6. Okay, and that's actually all I had to tell you here in this video. So that was the last couple of methods and functions that we learned about arrays. And indeed, we learned a lot of methods in this section, right? Now, keeping all of them in your mind to solve different tasks is, of course, a very hard thing to do. And so to make sense of all this mess, in the next video, I will help you decide which array method you should use in each situation to solve different problems.